A brand new Book of Common Prayer is causing quite a stir. And it's not your typical translation project.
Yeah, you could say that. It's more like a statement, really. This book, spearheaded by a figure named Marvin Clarence, it draws on all sorts of liturgical traditions, but it weaves them together in a way that's, distinctly traditionalist. And the language is, strong missionary language.
Speaking of Marvin Clarence, he's described as a no-compromise kind of guy in the sources. He's really committed to promoting the true religion of Christ.
Yeah, very interesting to see how his approach plays out, especially in the context of modern Indonesia. And he even collaborated on this with a group described as principal gentlemen of quality to create the book, which I have to say, that paints quite a picture in my mind.
I know, right? Makes you wonder what the discussions were like. But let's get to the book itself. The title is a mouthful. The Book of Common Prayer and Administration of the Lord's Supper, according to the use of the Latin Rite of the Church in the vulgar Indonesian tongue. So what do you make of that?
Well, you can see right away that formality and tradition are front and center, right? Even the title leans heavily into that whole history and structure of Anglican liturgy. And that phrase, vulgar Indonesian tongue, that's a term borrowed from older translations. It refers to the common language of the people.
So it's rooted in tradition, but also intended for everyday use.
Interesting. And our sources describe it as being heavily Anglo-Catholic. Can you break that down for us a bit? What does that mean?
Sure. So Anglo-Catholicism, it's a movement within, so you'll see things like, elaborate vestments, incense, a strong emphasis on the sacrament. And then there's this whole other layer of missionary work that comes through in this book. And Marvin Clarence, he doesn't shy away from using the word heathen. It's a term that definitely raises some eyebrows today.
For sure. I mean, it sparks this immediate debate, doesn't it, about how we use and understand language, especially in a religious context, Is it simply a matter of historical accuracy, or is it insensitive? Potentially alienating.
Yeah. Tough questions for sure. And speaking of potentially controversial elements, this Book of Common Prayer includes the Athanasian Creed, the one known for its very strong doctrinal statement.
Oh yeah, you could definitely say that. I mean, it's very specific about defining the Trinity and, the consequences of not adhering to that definition. It's not exactly known for its subtleties.
Definitely not. And their services included like prayers at midday for missions, which we're told Clarence adapted from the 1962 Canadian Book of Common Prayer. He seems to be drawing from a real variety of sources.
He is, and that's actually quite significant, I think. Especially those with traditionalist leanings. They're looking back to these older liturgical forms, and they're adapting them for contemporary use. It's almost a way of reclaiming what they see as, the Church's true heritage.
So it's both preserving tradition and innovating at the same time, in a way, taking those older forms and reshaping them for a new audience in a new context.
And that leads us to Marvin Clarence's own words. In the preface of this book, he starts by acknowledging the Church's freedom to adapt, its liturgical forms, but then he adds this caveat right away.
He emphasizes upholding the very heart of the true faith.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
So there's a line there. It seems like he's drawing a line. Like, change is okay, but only within the bounds of core Christian doctrine. And he goes on to state very clearly that his purpose in creating this book is to bring the heathen to the true Christian religion.
There's that missionary zeal again. He's not mincing words about his intentions. And he invites readers to compare his book to other sources, like the 1662 Book of Common Prayer and the Divine Worship Missal.
Yeah.
What do you think he does that?
Well, it could be a way of kind of, showcasing his scholarship, maybe. Like, look, I've done my homework. I'm well-versed in all of this liturgical history. Or maybe it's a way of anticipating criticism,
Right.
Saying, look, I'm not just making this up. I'm building on a solid foundation.
Interesting. It's like he wants to be seen as both a reformer and a guardian of tradition at the same time.
Yeah, and he wraps up this preface by expressing hope that the book will be a tool for both edification and conversion.
Which makes sense given his stated goals, right?
Yeah.
He wants to strengthen the faith of those who already believe, but also attract new converts. Pretty ambitious impact he's aiming for.
Ambitious is an understatement, I think. Now, we've got these two reviews of the book that we want to look at, and they offer some pretty contrasting perspectives. One from a priest who's clearly aligned with Clarence's traditionalist views, and the other, let's just say they have some reservations. I'm curious to hear how they differ.
Yeah, I think that's where it gets really interesting. Let's unpack those and see what they tell us about how this, this bold new prayer book is being received. So this first review, it's from the traditionalist priest, and it is, well, glowing. He praises the book's beauty, its reverence, and yes, its missionary zeal. He even defends the use of heathen, arguing that it's just, well, consistent with historical language.
So no shying away from that controversy at all. What about the other review? This one, the second priest, is much more cautious. I mean, he acknowledges the book's artistry, the beauty of it, but he expresses concern about the potential impact, He argues that in a country like Indonesia, a place where religious diversity is so deeply woven in society, that using language like this could be perceived as, well, exclusionary. And he really advocates for a more inclusive approach.
That's a really important point. I mean, Indonesia it's a place where Islam, Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, and various indigenous faiths.
Exactly. And that historical context, I think, adds another layer to this whole discussion. Because this new prayer book, it's not just a theological document, it's also a cultural artifact, right?
Yeah.
And the language it uses, especially when it comes to describing those outside the Christian faith, well, it carries a lot of weight.
It's a reminder that words have power. And the way we talk about religion, especially when we're talking about the other, it can have real-world consequences.
Absolutely. And that brings us to a question for you. As you think about this new prayer book and the contrasting reactions it's provoked, what stands out to you as particularly significant?
For me, it's this tension between tradition and modernity, and how this book is navigating that tightrope walk. Because on the one hand, you have Marvin Clarence drawing on these very old liturgical forms, very formal language, this very clear sense of what he believes to be, true Christianity. But on the other hand, he's doing all of this in a modern context, a diverse context, a world that's increasingly interconnected, and where religious pluralism is just a reality.
How do you remain rooted in your core beliefs?
Marvin Clarence clearly believes that there are limits to how much you can change and still maintain, true faith. But where those limits lie and who gets to decide, well, those are questions that can lead to some pretty heated debates.
Oh, you're absolutely right. And it's not just about theological doctrines or liturgical practices either. It's also about language. About how we talk about our beliefs and how we talk about those who hold different beliefs. Marvin Clarence's use of heathen, that's a prime example. How a single word can become this flashpoint, a symbol of these deeper divisions.
Yeah, it's a reminder that language isn't neutral, is it? It carries history. It carries this cultural baggage. And it can be used to include or exclude, to build bridges or to reinforce barriers.
And that brings us back to that second priest's critique, right? He's arguing that in a context like Indonesia, language that might have been considered acceptable in the past, it can now be perceived as insensitive, even offensive. He's calling for a more conscious approach, one that acknowledges the diversity of beliefs.
It's a call for greater sensitivity and awareness.
And that brings us to another critical question. What does this all mean for you, the listener? How does this situation in Indonesia, this tension between tradition and modernity, this debate about religious language, how does it resonate with your own experiences and understanding of faith and the world around you?
It's amazing how a prayer book can become such a lightning rod, and spark all these big conversations about tradition, language, religious identity.
It really speaks to the power of ritual, I think, and how we articulate our beliefs. And in this case, with this new Indonesian Book of Common Prayer, well, those articulations they're raising some pretty thought-provoking questions.
It seems like this book is maybe tapping into this resurgence of traditionalism that we're seeing. And this Indonesian Book of Common Prayer with its emphasis on older liturgical forms and its strong doctrinal statements and its very traditional understanding of missionary work, it seems to align with that movement.
It does. And it'll be interesting to see how the reception of this book in Indonesia might influence or be influenced by those global conversations. Will it spark similar efforts to reclaim older forms of worship and mission? I think these are questions that will probably unfold over time.
Almost like we're watching this kind of liturgical experiment.
Well, yeah.
Unfolding in real time. And the results could have ripple effects far beyond Indonesia. So as we start to wrap up this deep dive, what's the key takeaway you hope our listeners will walk away with?
I think the most important takeaway is that religion is dynamic.
It's like a reminder that even ancient traditions, they still have something to say to us today. And they can be reimagined in ways that speak to the needs and concerns of today's world.
Exactly. And I'd really encourage our listeners to keep exploring these questions.
And this new Indonesian Book of Common Prayer, with all its complexities and contradictions, it gives us a fascinating lens, doesn't it, to explore them.
It's been a rich and insightful deep dive, and I hope it sparks some curiosity and maybe some new perspectives for our listeners.
As always, we appreciate you joining us on this journey of discovery.